Okay. Hi, Giuseppe. It's Dave coming to you from the past. Thought I'd put together a little bit of an explanation about how I produce podcasts at the moment and perhaps how we might do these next 15 or 16 podcast episodes together. So I'll just walk you through, perhaps just give you a bit of a context about how the whole podcast system works in general. So I've done a little diagram here which just illustrates the podcast episode life cycle. So if we start up at the top left of the diagram, we can see the entity being the podcaster themselves. So in general terms, the podcaster will be using either a microphone or a lapel mic or some ear pods that they've plugged into their smartphone. And we also need a laptop in this scenario as well, which I'll explain a little bit later. So this describes the whole recording process. The guest or the host in the podcast, they plug their earpods, lapel mic or microphone directly into their smartphone rather than their laptop. I'll explain the laptop bit a little bit later. We then use a combination of voice memos, Audacity, and or Zoom, and that will generate a recording for us, and it'll generate multiple recordings. There'll be recordings from the Zoom meeting. There could also be an Audacity recording, and there'll also be a recording on the voice memos app if they're using an iPhone or just whatever the recording program is that you use on Android. So this generates a set of files which are usually in all of M4A format, MP3, or WAV, and WAV being high studio quality. We tend to discourage that a little bit because WAV files are usually about 15 times the size of an MP3, so it's a lot of data to move around the place. So essentially that's how the recording process works. The podcaster and the host plug their earpods into their smartphones. We then have a Zoom recording running independently, and that Zoom recording is turned down to very low volume at both ends so that the guest and the host can hear themselves, but the physical recording is actually done by the smartphone. And that generates a whole bunch of files. Okay, at the end of that process, there will then be a sharing of files from both the host and the guest phones, and because they're usually rather large files, it'll normally save them up to the cloud. They're usually too big to email. And then at some stage so generally the host will collate the recordings from the host and the guest and then forward them on to me for production, so off to the producer. And beyond that, we then use Audacity to do the production phase, which is all the editing of the podcast, lining up the tracks, removing breaths, and tacking on an intro, usually a standard intro and outro, onto the top and tail of the podcast. And then there'll be a review process where we send it back to the host or back to the podcast and just have a little bit of a listen, seeing if what they want, if it was the way they wanted it. So once we've got that approved, I then by this stage have a recording link. So we've finished the entire produced recording, and that's provided back to the host in a link, or back to whoever the person is who's going to be actually doing the distribution of the podcast. So again, we'll talk some more about that later. At the moment, for me, I'm the producer as well as the distributor of the podcast as well. So once we have that recording, we put that recording into a schedule, which I'll show you in a minute. And my mouse is just dripping in and out. Okay. So a combination of the recording link, the title for the podcast episode, an episode description, which is sometimes written by me, but more often written by the podcaster themselves. And we usually have a photo that we can attach to the podcast, which is generally, say, the LinkedIn portrait of the guest that the podcaster is interviewing. So all four of those elements are combined together inside a blog post, which is done in a WordPress website. That could be the podcaster's WordPress website, or it could be mine. In the case of Jules' podcast that we're doing today, it's being distributed on my WordPress website. And so once we've compiled this blog post with all of those four elements, we then drop it into a schedule. So the post will be scheduled to appear on a certain date and time. Again, that's specified in the podcaster's schedule. And then when that scheduled date and time comes up, two things happen. So the blog post itself is sent through a special little plugin that we've got in WordPress called PowerPress, and that generates the key document in all of this called an RSS feed. Stands for really simple syndication, and that RSS feed is a file that will contain all of the elements of the blog post and all of the previous episodes from the podcast, and then there's an automatic process where it simply sends that feed, the podcast channels out here actually have a look inside the RSS feed, which is stored on my website, and if there's a change, then they will automatically list a new episode to be available. So podcast channels include Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, so there's quite a few of them, and most podcasters will distribute out to multiple podcast channels. The other thing that happens is that the blog post itself is published. Now that is published from the WordPress site, and my WordPress site is connected up at the moment to LinkedIn and Facebook. So when the podcast is due for publication, it will then automatically produce a social media post in both LinkedIn and Facebook. And so that is essentially the end of the podcast episode Life Cycle.